Hello there, everyone. Oh, my microphone is falling apart. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Some new faces to me. So in case you don't know, the Wilson Center, we were created by Congress in 1968 as a memorial to Woodrow Wilson. So instead of a statue for pigeons, created a foreign policy think tank because, why?
The U.S. desperately needs good foreign policy.
Well, there's that. The State Department employee speaks.
And Woodrow Wilson is the only president to have a PhD.
Yes, thank you. So Danielle was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, so that was her quiz, which she passed for today. No longer, she's at the State Department. So welcome to the Wilson Center. And so I've been here for just now 20 years, and a big part of my work has been around water. Did my dissertation in China on the politics of water management. And so I like to dive into water whenever I can. And in the last few years, I've done a lot of work on the water energy confrontations in China, not just first coal's water footprint, and then now we've been swimming in wastewater. I'm looking at the energy footprint of wastewater and sludge treatment. My daughter always says, "What are you doing?" But it's an incredibly important issue. In fact, in Madrid right now, all the cool people are in Madrid. But we're still fairly cool. The temperature's the same as here, and it's cloudy. So don't feel envious that you're not in Spain. But the climate COP is happening right now, and while CO2, that's like the star of the show, but methane emissions are getting bigger play, and we'll hopefully be talking about that. Because today, while the title of the talk is Closing the Loop on Wastewater in China and the U.S., we're also talking about climate change, climate emissions, why it makes closing the loop on wastewater so important. So I have three speakers. You have the bios. I don't like reading bios because, admit it, that's boring, right? But what we're going to do is we're going to start off with Danielle Neighbor. So I already mentioned she's over at the State Department in OES. And she came to me a little over a year ago. She was our Schwarzman Fellow. And she's engineering background. She was in China for a year at Tsinghua. And while at Tsinghua, she dove into wastewater in China, trying to understand. She was looking at wastewater, but really interested in water recycling, which is what you're going to start talking about. I had to put that because, hey, it's a fun slide that I made a while ago and want to get as much play of it as I can. So she's going to talk about challenges of recycling and wastewater treatment in China, but then it's going to be like a New York sandwich. So China at the beginning, New York, and China at the end. So kind of lessons on going both directions on wastewater. And then, fresh in from California, LA, we have Scott Houston, he is an elected member of the board of directors of West Basin Municipal Water District. So you're the president.
I'm the president.
And it's a special district that's kind of smack up next to LA, right? Not too terribly far from the airport.
Exactly.
And it's a special wholesale water agency, serving 1 million people in 17 cities. He's going to tell you more. You got his bio there. But he's the recycling guy, water recycling. It's a trend that should take the country by fire, but maybe not quite yet. But hopefully talking about the low carbon nature of all this. So water is actually very high carbon. So after Scott's done, and we'll wow you with his stories, we will close out with, you're the closing pitcher. The Nats won the World Series, so baseball is still very heavily on my mind here. Don't tell me you're not a Nats fan.
Huge Nats fan.
Huge Nats fan. Okay.
Our son was in the parade.
The correct answer is, when you talk to me, is yes, I'm a Nats fan. So Patrick Sarfas, he has led the American Biogas Council since 2010. Initially, you put it together, right?
Yeah, not by myself. But yes, but not by myself.
Okay. So it's the only trade association representing the entire biogas industry.
That's right.
In the U.S., and if you don't know what biogas industry is, you will at the end of this talk today. You've been, I guess you dive in, I don't know if you swim in biogas, but you've been doing biogas for quite a while now?
I went feet first into biogas.
But you did used to go dive into the ocean because he was an oceanographer.
That's true. I did physical oceanography for a little while before I got into
science
renewable
background, communications.
Communications, business background.
But we need that too. So we've got a good crowd here for you. Your job, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be to ask challenging questions of them. I've given them strict time limits. On your mark, get set. Tell your story, Danielle. Thank you so much for coming, and there's coffee outside if you need it.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I see some friendly faces in the room, but for those of you that don't know me, like Jennifer said, I was a fellow here at the Wilson Center and have since started the seed department. But I'm here to talk about research that I did both at the Wilson Center and prior to that when I was in China. And we're going to talk about ways that we can close the loop on wastewater. How can we make wastewater, which is traditionally an industry focused on producing waste, and turn that waste into profit? We'll use examples from the US, specifically New York City, to think about ways that China can improve its wastewater management. So to start off, does anyone know what % of the water in China is polluted?
So polluted it shouldn't come in contact with human beings.
You guys are guessing so well.
Guessing. Wait. 92. Too high.
We're kind of in the middle, so it's somewhere around 50%, depending on who you ask. But 50% of all surface water in China is too polluted to even come into contact with humans. That's not to drink, but to be touched by a human. So China's really got a water pollution and a wastewater problem. To add to that, China produces 40 million tons of sludge. About 80% of that, depending on who you ask, we think they're getting much better. It might be down to 70, 75, but a significant amount of the sludge that's produced by China goes straight into waterways and is illegally dumped in some capacity. So China really has a lot of room to improve, and as China begins to urbanize and develop its municipal wastewater capacity, the country really faces an opportunity to turn its waste into profit and turn those wastewater treatment plants into resource recovery facilities. When we start to think about why it's important to responsibly develop these wastewater treatment plants in China, there's two things I want to have in the back of our minds. The first is that wastewater treatment takes about a third of a city's municipal energy demand. So if there's a way that we can take the energy that could be created in the wastewater treatment process and turn it back into the treatment center, then we can reduce that energy demand on Chinese cities or any city, and we're able to really change the paradigm of cities' sustainable wastewater treatment. Secondly, landfilling sludge is really expensive. A medium to large city spends about $100,000 per day landfilling sludge. So if we can keep that sludge out of landfills, we can save money, we can save energy. So to make sure we're all on the same page, just to talk about how standard wastewater treatment works. First, the customer makes wastewater. It goes to the wastewater treatment plant where it goes through a process called clarification. And that means that we're settling out the big stuff. That's solids, sand, and grit. And that goes standard wastewater treatment plant. That means that goes to a landfill, if we're lucky, and not into a waterway in China.
Dumped in a farmer's field.
And then while that sludge is in a landfill, it's creating methane, which, as Jennifer mentioned, methane is a greenhouse gas. And I'll let Patrick touch more on this. But essentially, during that process of landfilling, bacteria is eating away that sludge. It's creating methane. The methane's going into the atmosphere. Back to the wastewater treatment plant. The water that's left after big stuff is settled out goes through a process called aeration, where bad bacteria is eaten out, much like Pac-Man. And then it's disinfected and goes into some sort of surface water body. But there's ways that we can change this wastewater treatment process, and there's opportunities for profit. So if we think about the places in that process where waste is created, we can change that and use a process called anaerobic digestion. So here on the right, there's an anaerobic digester from Newtown Creek in New York City. And in anaerobic digestion, that process that's occurring in the landfill, that eating of the sludge and producing of methane, we can do that in a closed environment and capture that methane. Once the methane is captured, we can actually use that for power. We can power the wastewater treatment plant, which is great because we know they require a lot of energy. We can use it for vehicle fuel, or we can sell it to a power distributor. Then we can take the sludge that's left in that anaerobic digester and turn it into fertilizer. Finally, instead of putting that water into a surface water body, we can actually recycle it back to the customer. We can do that through indirect or direct potable reuse. And then as we're thinking about this, there are two main challenges that wastewater treatment plants face on a municipal level that I'll also touch on. The first is combined sewers. So a combined sewer actually transports both stormwater and wastewater together. And these are an especially significant issue when we think about anaerobic digestion, because what you're what you're getting when you're doing anaerobic digestion is you want to create a lot of methane because if we're going to use that methane productively, we need to be able to have more of it. So when we are digesting that, we want essentially to give those germs those microbes a lot of fuel. So we don't want watered down wastewater. We don't want wastewater that's been transported with stormwater because that will make anaerobic digestion more difficult. Finally, we want to think about climate resilience. How do we keep wastewater treatment plants functional in the face of a changing climate? So what will this look like going back to that initial wastewater treatment process? How can we improve it? First, we're still going to go through the clarification process, but instead of putting those solids in a landfill, we'll put them in an anaerobic digester. We'll capture that methane and use it productively, and then we'll treat that sludge and use it productively as well.
And make money.
We're still going to go through that aeration process as well as that disinfection process, but instead of putting that water into surface water like a river or a lake, we're going to recycle it back to the customer. So how does this look in China? While I was at Tsinghua, I specifically looked at Beijing's water recycling. And Beijing is very interesting because it actually has a lot of water recycling. Unfortunately, the water recycling that's going on in Beijing is highly decentralized. So we've got an extremely populous city, but we have heavily decentralized water recycling. So any building that is 30,000 square meters or larger is required to have a water reuse center inside of the building. Unfortunately, that means that people like landlords are responsible for operating a water recycling plant. And so that leads those plants to being not used. Only about 50% of them are even online, not trusted by the customer, and they're not monitored at all. There's no legal requirement to have those systems be monitored. And so that leads to municipal wastewater treatment plants falling behind with very rare anaerobic digestion. There's some good news that some cities like Beijing does have one great anaerobic digester, as is Shenzhen, but overall municipal anaerobic digestion has a lot of room to grow in a country with heavy urban centers that present great opportunities for anaerobic digestion. So looking at ways that we can improve China's wastewater treatment plants, I wanted to look at one city in particular so we have something to start with. New York City is a good case study to use because while it has about a third of the population of Beijing, it actually has more wastewater treatment capacity than Beijing. And the per capita daily water use is about the same, as is the number of municipal wastewater treatment plants. So to start with something great that New York City does, they use a process called co-digestion. So as I mentioned before, we want heavily organic waste going into these anaerobic digesters so that we can create more methane. The way that New York makes that waste more organic is they collect food waste from different areas of the city and put it into anaerobic digesters. So here's pictured Newtown Creek, which has 8 anaerobic digesters, 4 of which are using co-digestion. And that keeps both food waste and municipal solid waste out of landfills and creates more methane. Then New York is able to use that methane productively. They convert it to energy through fuel cells and generators, and then they're in the process of selling it to National Grid, which is New York's power distributor. Fortunately, New York has some room to grow with its sludge management. It often ships sludge out to the rural South and the Midwest, and as a Kansan, I especially don't like this. So it definitely has some room to grow with its sludge management and being able to use that sludge productively. So to think about how this would apply to China, again, 80% of sludge in China has been illegally dumped. Because of some great laws, including the Water 10 plan in China, this may have reduced slightly, but we're still at 75%.
Can I throw a stat at you?
Yeah.
So China, they've had a success on wastewater treatment plants. I mean, particularly after when they were announced they were getting the Olympics for 2008. And so but they only have about 70 anaerobic digesters in China with only 5 to 10 functioning well.
Lots of room
not
to
enough. Lots of room to grow.
Is that just a wastewater or is that
just
overall?
for wastewater?
That's for, yeah.
Just for wastewater treatment plants, and they could all, it could be really good to do this also for all the piggeries, food production, but that's not happening quite yet.
Thanks, Jennifer. And then thinking about ways that we can make these systems more resilient. So New York, during Hurricane Sandy, 8 out of the city's 14 wastewater treatment plants came offline. That led to massive sludge dumping in waterways and on streets. And so in response to that, New York created a wastewater resiliency plan and is one of the first cities to have created such a plan. That is a $20 billion effort, and I can get into more of the specifics of what that looks like if anyone's interested. But the thing to think about for China is that when we think about those large Chinese cities, so many of them are on the coast, and 12% of China's population lives in low elevation coastal zones. When we think about treatment plants that are at risk, we've got a significant amount of China's population that would be fed by those municipal wastewater treatment plants that are at risk of flooding. And then again, these combined sewer overflows, they happen about once a week in New York City, and we have to be able to create different solutions. So obviously the best solution is to create separated stormwater and wastewater systems, but that's incredibly expensive, and a lot of these systems are really old. So there's some options that we can explore, and New York has started to implement to prevent these, including permeable pavements, drainage corridors, and natural catchment areas. And then thinking about how this applies to China, we know that Shanghai, Guangzhou, and a lot of other cities have significant combined sewer overflows. Numbers are hard to find because they're not monitored well, but we know that almost 500,000 tons per day flow into the Liuxi River. So to kind of wrap all of this up and think about how we can apply it to China, China really has an opportunity to turn waste into profit here. So first, by centralizing that wastewater treatment and that water recycling, and then using anaerobic digestion and food waste co-digestion can really allow that waste to be turned into profit. As China begins to think about, like Jennifer mentioned, we're thinking about COP and NDCs, nationally determined contributions. China can really help meet its Paris Agreement requirements by using these processes. And then it can also treat and use biosolids as fertilizer. Finally, recycling water can really help lower the burden on China's water crisis. We know that China has severe water challenges, especially in cities like Beijing, which are situated in the desert. So recycling water can really reduce that. Finally, we can address combined sewers and make those plants resilient to shock so that once we've created these resource recovery facilities, we know that they're able to continue operating in perpetuity. And then to finally address that water recycling, those challenges that I mentioned in Beijing, the ways that we can address those issues are first, enforcement and monitoring. We have to monitor these systems so that we can have the public instill trust in them. Second, we need to provide operation and maintenance support. So if people who don't have an understanding of how these systems function are required to operate them, they need to receive some sort of support for operating and maintaining those systems. Third, centralized capacity really should improve in Beijing. So we have a city that is incredibly urbanized, and Beijing is not capitalizing on economies of scale by having its water recycling decentralized. Finally, public education is a huge component of any water recycling effort. I'm sure some of you in this room have heard of that toilet to tap idea, and we can really change the public opinion of water recycling very quickly. So if we talk about it as toilet to tap, public fear can be instilled, but instead speaking about it as something that we know is safe and we know is in the best interest of the city and therefore in the best interest of its citizens, it's important to consider the way that the public is spoken to about what kind of public efforts and public outreach is done by municipalities in terms of water reuse. And then finally, just to put it all together, this is my bad attempt at a PowerPoint wastewater treatment plant when we have all of this happening together. So we've got sludge, food waste is processed, goes into anaerobic digesters. Then the best part is at the end, we have profit that's being produced instead of just waste.
Before you go off that slide, can I interject because of the work I've been doing with the EPA? Mm-hmm. But if you guys look at it, think of the sludge, that's the wastewater bureaucrats. And food waste is the solid waste bureaucrats. And so that's been, but in China, the Ministry of Housing and Urban and Rural Development, they house both those functions for cities. But it's been taking some time, but they're still in different offices within that same ministry. So it's just, the stovepiping sometimes can be a real hindrance to getting these two sides to even talk to each other. But it's getting better. I think you'll talk, in California, you guys have done it, and so we want to hear how you did. So all right. interjection stopping.
That's okay. And that's it for me.
Okay,
I'll
good.
pass it off.
All right, thank you so much. Some slight applause or loud applause.
Thank you.
We'll do some questions at the end, so we're going to go to Scott next.
Thank you. And is there a way you can put it right here?
Oh, here I've got.
Well, so I can see it.
Oops, sorry. I accidentally did you click that?
No, I did not.
Okay, click
we
it
can go
back.
back.
Sorry.
There you go.
There we go.
Perfect. Okay, I'll do my best to.
I'll move it a little
Oh,
bit,
there we
so I
go.
just don't wanna disconnect.
Can't quite see, and some of the slides will have a little bit of text on them. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and yes, fresh in from California, and happy to take part in this panel, but also to speak a little bit about my water district and some things from the California perspective that I think tie well into this topic, as well as what China has been experiencing.
Do you want to sit here? Would it be
Yeah,
easier?
why not? Yeah,
Oh,
I'll
we're
sit
gonna play
there if you don't
musical
mind.
chairs.
If you don't
Why
mind.
not? Come on.
But what I was gonna say is,
It's just this computer, if I move it, I'll
yeah,
disconnect
yeah,
it, and
no
that would
worries.
be a greater catastrophe.
I do want to be able to read some of the things I have on here for you
Yeah.
guys, or you're gonna think I'm a fish out of water here. No, but to be honest with you, number one, I was like, wow, you guys give me so much material right away from the start. But I will preface this really fast. Toilet to tap, obviously that got a really bad connotation in California water many years ago, and it took a long time for us to overcome that. And so there are some other verbiage, uses that we're trying to push out there, like flange to flange, or
What?
showers,
What?
flange to flange, or showers to flowers. So those are two. Seriously, these are two more comedic ones we've got. But
I think half the room doesn't know what a flange is.
yeah, well, I think all of us are kind of like, yeah, what is that? Well, from one, when the water's coming into one location, going to another, but literally like as it's going from the wastewater treatment plant, potentially to your faucet, potentially to your tap. But there's a lot that's involved in that, and actually in California, we're not there legally yet. But I will say polling in the last 2-3 years was over 50% support and approval for direct potable reuse, or flange to flange, or showers to flowers, whatever you want to call it. And my other thing, by the way, I do love your slide you had up there with the guy diving.
Yeah.
That actually was really good because, and I didn't bring a picture. I should have in my slides.
You're diving into a
No,
wastewater
but we
treatment?
do have. It's kind of a joke, but we do have. When you tour our plant out in California, there is strategically placed a no diving sign as you're walking through the facility.
I've been there, and I did notice that. I'm like,
But all right, I digress. So, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about West Basin and who we are and how we are in relation to water with the city of Los Angeles and west side of LA County. But we have a very basic mission: provide safe and reliable supply of high-quality water to the communities we serve. We are a special district in the state of California, so water districts, we all operate under the California Water Law of 1911, which allows you to form water districts, so they could be large or small. We're pretty robust. We are 17 cities, almost 1 million residents on the west side of LA County. We have 5 elected board members. We each represent a division, so I happen to be the areas in red. But this is basically, if you're all familiar with LA, this is Greater Los Angeles. We are a lot of the independent cities in and around the city of LA, or just to the south especially, but also going up to Malibu on the north, and then coming down the Palos Verdes Peninsula on the south, which is near Long Beach, for those who might be a little familiar with our geography. But what I wanted to show here is, and we are a pretty big water district in the region, but we are part of the bigger Southern California picture. So you see us now, and now I'm going to flip to, this is the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, which is sort of the overarching water district in our region. And there are 26 member agencies. And you can kind of see West Basin, we're right in the middle on the peninsula there.
so just so you know, this PowerPoint will be put online, so you can
Yeah.
dive deeper later.
And I wanted to put this in. There's a couple more great slides in here just to give you context. So this area right here represents about 19 million residents, and we have, mainly 2 aqueduct systems that are coming into this area that are serving us. And then Los Angeles has their own aqueduct, and I'm going to show you that in a second. But you have to think, California is almost 40 million people, And about 19 million of us are dependent in some way, shape, or form on this imported water. We call it imported water. And what that means is the water that we are bringing into our service area from faraway locations through our aqueduct system. And so just to give you an idea, where does Metropolitan or MWD, where do they get that imported water that we're talking about? So obviously the Colorado River Aqueduct is what serves our area coming into Southern California, but that water is coming as far away, obviously, as Colorado, working its way through 7 states, and eventually down to Mexico. So you have a number of regions dependent on that one particular water source, and as we get down into Southern California, especially towards, let's say, San Diego, or at, obviously Mexico, they're at the bottom of the whole chain there when it comes to water from that source. And then we also have our Northern California supply source, which I'm going to go into on the next slide. But again, it just shows you, which of course that's what China is doing as well, that there's areas where you have water and there's areas where you don't, and you have to move it around. I really love this slide because I think it puts everything into perspective for California. So we, in the southern part of the state, we have 3 water sources that serve us. The yellow aqueduct there, 233-mile aqueduct, that is the LA aqueduct. So that was built by Mulholland back in the 1911 and 1913 period to serve the city of Los Angeles. So LA still owns and operates that aqueduct. It used to supply a significant amount of the water to the city, but over time it's been reduced in particular because they were overtaking too much water from the Owens Valley. So at this time, I think it runs usually about 20% of LA's water supply is through that aqueduct. And then the other 2 you see on there, so the blue one is the Colorado River Aqueduct, and that was built in the 1920s, going into the 30s, I should say, really. It was authorized in 27, but over the Depression was when they actually built it. And I believe it started production in 1945. But that was a huge source of water supply for Southern California. And then later, the third aqueduct, which is in red, that's our state water project. So that's the water that's bringing, or the aqueduct bringing water from Northern California, from the Sierras. It flows through near Sacramento, flows through Oroville, where we had the dam that nearly failed a couple of years ago. You probably all heard about that in the news. But again, you look at this is about, this is about 2/3 of our water supply coming into the region. As a matter of fact, there it is, almost 60% of our water supply for almost 20 million people. And 2/3 of our precipitation is falling in northern parts of our state, while about 2/3 of our populace live in the south. So we're very dependent on the imported water, as well as what groundwater we do have, and then what I will be talking about, which is recycled water and other water sources. But in our local area, we are dependent on groundwater. We do have some groundwater in our area, and other parts of our service area, they don't have any groundwater. So it's in pockets, even near the beach, near the ocean. And then, of course, we get our water from the Colorado River and from the State Water Project, which is the Delta. Just to give you some perspective, so back in 1947, when our district was formed, all we had was groundwater. And the reason they formed the water district where I live is because they were overdrafting the groundwater, and they were getting saltwater intrusion. And they had to find an alternative water source as the population was growing. So you can see this is right after World War II. There's a lot of growth in Southern California. They formed the West Basin Water District really to buy water from Metropolitan, from the Colorado River Aqueduct, and get additional supplemental water coming into our residents. And so you fast forward all the way up until about 1990, and you can see by then we were very dependent on imported water. The 2 aqueducts that we have access to, because we do not get any of the water from the Los Angeles Aqueduct. That's just for the city of LA. So all of us independent cities, we have the other 2 aqueducts that provide for us. And by the way, LA is a member of Met, so they actually buy that water too. So they're getting water from 3 different sources. Ultimately, we're all competing for this water that's coming into our service area. But fast forward to today, and we've really diversified our portfolio. And our water district is, much more forward-thinking and ahead of the game than a lot of them were. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a major drought, which is where the leadership at the time embarked on recycled water. And so you can see right now we've lowered our threshold of dependence on imported water to about 55%. We do a lot of conservation work. That's the green arrow, shaded area. And we do about 9 to 10% of recycled water to serve our constituents. Obviously, climate change and all the challenges that we face, and certainly not unique to the West, but for us, of course, lots of up and downs with drought. Some are very short, some are very long. We have extreme record temperatures, as you know. We have wildfires. It just seems like our wildfire season doesn't end anymore at this time in California. And then we have competing demands. So the environment really, at this day and age, we look at the environment as a customer of water, especially in the areas where you could potentially take water. So if that's where those aqueducts begin, up in the Sierras or over in the Owens Valley, there's been a lot of litigation, and we can't pull the same amount of water that we used to. So that's one of the customers, if you think about it, before it even gets into an aqueduct to serve us. And we have agricultural interests, we have urban interests. And obviously, it's earthquake country. So all the aqueducts I've mentioned, they're crisscrossing faults multiple times, and then infrastructure in general. Most of this is older infrastructure. There's constant maintenance and making sure it's going to supply the folks as we need it to. So basically, looking at West Basin and who we are and our role as a water district in Southern California, just really focused what we call water for tomorrow. We want to have a secure water supply, locally controlled, which that's why water reuse or recycled water is a big thing. This is a projection for the future in 2030 that we still want to continue lowering our dependence on imported water. We want to push conservation heavier. We are building out our recycled water program, so it incrementally gets larger. And we are looking at ocean water desalination as a potential option too. So if that was in the mix, that could be potentially 10 or 11% of our portfolio. Real quick, it was mentioned earlier, is conservation. That's a very big deal. Of course, you can never, take your foot off the gas on conservation. So we have a lot of programs for our residents, whether it's free rain barrels, taking out your turf, rebates for water efficient appliances. One of the biggest things we're pushing right now, all of us in Southern California, is take out your grass. We are incentivizing that. So Metropolitan will give you up to $2 a square foot, and West Basin will throw in an extra $1. So we've got a pretty robust program right now to push residents to change out the grass and put in drought-tolerant landscapes and plants. Real fast here on our recycled water, because I want to get into the nitty-gritty of the system. But, like I said, back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a major drought, and West Basin was very beholden to imported water or what limited groundwater we had. And so our agency looked at a local drought-proof supply source. And we have a unique situation because we don't own a treatment plant. We don't own a wastewater treatment plant. So we actually partnered with the City of Los Angeles to buy their treated effluent. Otherwise, a portion of that would have gone out to the ocean. It would have been lost into the Pacific. And so we worked with them to purchase that water. We built a facility in the early 90s that is world-renowned. And we have not only our plant, but a series of satellite facilities. I'm going to show you some pictures in a moment. But partnerships are very important, and I thought that was what's really interesting when you talk about China and how we're all trying to make everything work together. So at West Basin, obviously, we have our partnership with the City of Los Angeles. We had to, of course, secure the real estate for the infrastructure, different public-private partnerships for operations and customer engagement, and public outreach was huge. So back in the late 80s, early 90s, recycled water, that was a new thing for a lot of folks, and you had to get a lot of buy-in, as well as it's going to be additional cost for those ratepayers to take on some debt. And our major funding sources back at the time were the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, Army Corps of Engineers, California Department of Water Resources, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, which has a number of incentives for its member agencies to develop local resource projects, and private funding. So some of our customers, obviously, they had skin in the game. So if say it was a refinery, that they're going to get some of that recycled water, that was, that they would put some funding into this. And this is just a breakdown on the percentage of where some of that funding came from. But the recycled water are key program statistics at West Basin. So we produce 40 million gallons a day of recycled water at our plant. It's just south of LAX. We have over 100 miles of purple pipe distribution system across our region, more than 400 connections. And basically, it conserves enough drinking water for 135,000 households a year. And I'm going to get into what are the details. Yeah, right here. What are the details of that water? So our water, this is, it's not water you're going to drink. It's not going to come into your tap. but it's used for different purposes. So one of them is the top one's irrigation. So outdoor irrigation, if it's golf courses, it's ornamental street landscaping, big lawns, maybe on a corporate campus or on a college campus. Then we have a lot of industrial use water because we have 3 refineries in our area. So you have high pressure and low pressure boiler feed water. One of the waters that we produce, the 4th one down here, the high pressure boiler feed, that's dual reverse osmosis. It's extremely pure. It goes to one of the refineries that's located actually across the street from our facility. We also have water for cooling towers, industrial throughout our area. And then the bottom one really is the very exciting one. That is where we're making water that is drinking water quality. You can come visit the facility and actually drink the water, but we have to inject that into the ground, into our the aquifer beneath our coastal communities to continue keeping out saltwater intrusion. So all these years later, that's still a piece of what we do that started this agency. And this is just a schematic, especially when you have slides, you can look at that of the 5 different waters and the different treatment processes that are involved.
Kind of like a boutique water shop.
We really are, yeah, and we call them fit for purpose or designed
Designer
for purpose.
water.
Yes, because these were specifically designed with those customers in mind. So if you're working with one of the refineries and they need a certain quality of water, it was designed to suit that need. Or working with the the groundwater treatment regulators to do that. Our recycled water system, as I said, about over 100 miles of purple pipe throughout our region. These are all a lot of our different partners, whether they're local city governments, there are private water company, retailers in the area. There's a lot of corporate partners if it's an industrial campus or a college campus, or let's say Honda. Honda has a very big campus in Torrance that we serve their outdoor irrigation. Real quick here, partnerships again. When it comes to the potable quality water that we produce, it is a very unique and complicated partnership because there's multiple entities involved. So we're buying, this pre-treated sewage water from Los Angeles, from DWP and Sanitation District. Then we are recycling that water. We're working with our contract operator. We own the plant, but our contract operator is Suez. They actually run the operation, if you will. We work with the LA County Department of Public Works, who has the groundwater wells that we inject through. Cal Water Service, they're the ones that actually maintain our lines. That's a contract. And then our retail customer that we actually sell to is called Water Replenishment District. So to be honest with you, it's a really complicated partnership, but it's over 20 years in existence, and it's tremendous. And this is what I'd also say, because Mayor Garcetti, of course, in the city of Los Angeles is talking about continuing to recycle more water. We want to lower the discharge that goes out into the ocean, and this is where California is heading. And of course, the mayor in our neighboring city of LA has really picked up that mantra and pushing us all hard to do that. And West Basin's a big partnership with Los Angeles to make that happen. We recently reached a production of 200 billion gallons of recycled water at our plant, so we're very proud of that. As we continue to expand the system, and we've upgraded it to produce more water down the road here. I'm almost done here. I just wanted to show this. I think is a really great graph that showcases, if you look, what this is back in about January 95. So this was before we built our plant. The city of Los Angeles was producing about 350 to 300, almost 375 million gallons a day of sewage that was being treated and discharged into the ocean. And when they built the West Basin facility, of course, then we could offset some of that and recycle it. And what this shows is 2 things. One is how much water savings the city of LA has done over the years. So if you see what it is now, they've gone from about 350 million gallons a day to about 250 million gallons a day. So the city of Los Angeles has done tremendous work on saving water as the population grew just for their city, right? And that's about 4 million people today. And then you see the delta and you see the shaded area, and that's where West Basin, producing up to 40 million gallons a day, that is, again, not lost to the ocean, goes out into our communities, is used for another purpose. That just shows the savings as well, and it's a great environmental story and environmental impact story for you. And I'll just touch on one last thing. So yes, we're a coastal district. And so for a long time, the district had been exploring desal, and we're still in the midst of that exploration, if you will. But we did recently certify an environmental impact report under California law that allows us to continue doing some more research to see if it might be an an opportunity for us to potentially build a facility in our service area. And again, we're separate than the city of Los Angeles, so we have our own policy and our own agenda and our own issues to deal with while the city is doing theirs. But it doesn't mean we're going to build a plant, but it means that we can continue to do a lot of financial and some other quantitative research to figure out, is this something that might make sense for our ratepayers, or it may not. And so that's just something that might be involved.
It's very high energy.
It is, it is high energy. And on that note, I mean, recycled water, it takes a lot of energy to produce recycled water, although that's becoming more efficient. Certainly desalinated water, the same story. And that imported water I talked about, the water that we buy from Metropolitan, it's treated before it gets to a service area like ours or all the other member agencies. That water, the price continues to go up, as well as every year, from year to year, we don't know how much we are going to get coming through the Delta or coming from the Colorado River system. So a lot of things are coming together at once that are pushing agencies like ours to diversify and look at every opportunity. And so I think that it shows there's agencies like ours that have done a lot of this work that hopefully others in China and other locations around the world can take advantage of.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yay. Yeah, while I'm switching, just one quick question. What about the energy footprint of the water transfers versus water recycling? You all have numbers on that?
We'd have numbers. I don't have the numbers with me, but that's one thing about it. About 20% of the energy usage in the state of California is for water movement, treatment, just all things water, wastewater. So, one of our biggest users of energy in the state of California is water, and that's why efficiency is very important. And so, yes, when we do look at the options of recycled water or its local production versus it coming from faraway places and having to pump it over those mountains, that plays into this as well.
And also, if you didn't have the transfers, just like Beijing, by the way, besides the South-North Water Transfer Project, for decades, Beijing has been stealing water from other cities. Tianjin, I remember about 10 years ago, Beijing said, we need your reservoir, bye. And so Tianjin was high and dry, and Tianjin has had to go to desal. So just giving you a little context here. And now, thinking another way to think about how can we close the loop on, well, you're going beyond wastewater, because what you do is not just, but there's another way that we can close the loop, make money, and a climate solution too, I assume. I put a lot on your plate to accomplish.
Well, thank you for having all of us. And I think, Jennifer's done a really good job of setting up, how anaerobic digestion works, and especially how it works at wastewater treatment plants, which is really, really helpful backdrop to have. And I think Scott's specific example for what they're doing in Southern California is also going to lead into what I'm going to share with you, which is a little bit about the national market for biogas overall. Then we're going to do that really quick, dive straight into the wastewater segment. I've got some data on how we're using biogas systems and anaerobic digestion in the U.S. And then I'm going to build on the New York example that Danielle gave earlier, and the examples in Southern California. I'll show you some other projects to see how we are using biogas systems differently at wastewater treatment plants, because what you'll find, and we were talking about this earlier when we were talking about some global efforts and another organization, the World Biogas Association that I'm on the board of, and how biogas systems, much like water, end up being hyperlocal very, very quickly. It's really hard to say, I'm going to do 10 systems like this because this one system worked really, really well, so I'm just going to do it 10 more times. It just doesn't work like that because their local resources are very different. That mix of organic material, the mix of what a local community needs, and what they have to provide that is always different. And so you end up basically having to customize your system to where you are. The good news is that the systems are very flexible. It just means that it's not going to be easy to do a cookie cutter. You just have to look at each area individually. And when you do that, you can really maximize the benefits. So I run the American Biogas Council, as Jennifer mentioned, and we are the trade association that represents the entire biogas industry. And this is the biogas industry in the US. So We have 2,000 operational biogas systems of all kinds across the country. When you look at those, we're including landfills in those as well, which are technically anaerobic digestion systems because that's what happens in a landfill is anaerobic digestion. But they are not as optimized as the commercial style anaerobic digesters that I'll be talking a little bit more about. So when you look at the 2,200 systems, you can see there's about 600 some landfills within that. That leaves about 1,800 digesters operational today across the country. And fortunately, I can say that pretty much all of those are operating really well. If they were not operating really well, they would not be making enough money and people would just shut them down. That's not really happening, except for in some very, very isolated instances. Like out of 2,000 systems, there might be a couple a year that shut down because a farmer, for example, can't get enough money for their electricity if they're making electricity, and then they just don't have enough revenue coming in. And so they just turn it off until they can get a better deal or do a capital investment to change their system to produce revenue from a different product. But the potential in the U.S. is absolutely massive. So 14,000 new systems. So we consider ourselves to be a commercial industry, but one that's very much in the beginning stages of developing the industry here. Here's all the material that we have to deal with. So lots of people look at biogas systems and they say, oh, well, let's just talk about energy. And that's really only one piece of the puzzle. As Danielle showed you, there's more than just the energy side. There's also the organic waste management side. And we have 66.5 million tons of food waste that we have to deal with somehow in the US. Even if we reduce that dramatically, food waste is proportional to the number of people. Unless we think our population is going to diminish significantly, I think that number is going to be pretty consistent. Hopefully it will slow in growth, but a huge number there. 31 billion gallons of wastewater every day. And when Danielle first started talking, I was trying to do some math on the 40 million tons of sludge that were produced. I was trying to back that into a comparison here, and I couldn't do it quite fast enough here. And then I realized I didn't know if that was 40 million tons a year or a day or whatever. But anyway, we have a lot of wastewater that we're producing, and of course that's proportional to our population as well. And then 8 billion cows, chicken, turkeys, and pigs. And so the manure from those animals and also the waste that you have to produce from processing those animals. I mean, if you think about it, it starts to get gross pretty quickly, but you slaughter an animal and they have stomachs, and that stomach is full of food that hasn't been fully digested, and that ends up being a large volume of material that you have to deal with. It's called punch. Got to do something with that. It is super gross. About the last thing you want to do is go sit that out in the air someplace to sit around. So why not put it in a closed, airtight biogas system? Also, when you're processing the animals, you have to use a lot of water to clean those materials. And that water is also gross, but it still has a lot of energy in it, usually because it has a lot of blood in it. And so that is also a big part of the agriculture side of the material that we have to manage here. So here's who we are, best organization for biogas in the US. All right, so diving right into the wastewater market. So we're going to put ag to the side. We're going to put food waste mostly to the side, although that's going to come in here a little bit here. So here is our snapshot of what the wastewater system looks like, or the industry looks like in the U.S. If you remember from the slide before, I showed you that there are 1,300 wastewater plants out of those 2,000 or so that are operational today. And those 2,000s are the green pie slice there. And so that means, you can see the potential there is huge. 3/4 of our wastewater facilities, and it's just counting the medium and large sized wastewater facilities. I'm only counting the ones that are larger than 1 million gallons a day. The reason for that is because, generally speaking, it's economically possible to develop a biogas system at a wastewater plant if it processes more than 1 million gallons a day in wastewater in general. It's just kind of a really rough rule of thumb. If you start adding food waste into that number dips down significantly, but this is just kind of a rough look. There's like 16,000 wastewater facilities, and about half of those or so are above 1 MGD. So we're just looking at the larger ones here, the greater than 1 MGD, and 3/4 of those don't have a biogas system. And then if you want to see digester technology, the ones that do, the mesophilic systems, that's basically a temperature. There's kind of two temperatures. There's like body temperature, so like 100 degrees, and then there's like higher than body temperature, which is like 160 degrees. That's thermophilic. Most of them are going to be mesophilic, and it's just a slightly simpler technology, although the high temperature ones have some benefits as well. So for anyone that's interested in figuring out, okay, well, is it only the super large wastewater facilities that have biogas systems, or is it the smaller ones? This is your answer to that. So all the orange bars are the opportunity. These are the number of systems where you don't have a biogas system. And the blue ones are where you do. And you can see that there's actually a pretty good distribution there. And there is opportunity everywhere. So we need more biogas systems, not unlike many other countries. Here's how people are using their biogas in the wastewater sector. So you can, when our facilities answered this question, you could check more than one box here, and lots of times you have wastewater facilities that are using the biogas to provide heating to the digester. Remember, you got to keep it at 100 degrees. So if you're in Southern California, you have less of a heating need than you do if you're in Minnesota or New York, for example. But you're generally going to need heat at some place to keep it at that 100 degrees. And so you're going to probably use some of the biogas for that. Lots of folks are generating electricity, and I've circled the top for pipeline injection. That basically means biogas is basically like 60% methane and 40% CO2. Conventional natural gas is like 99% methane. And so for biogas, if you take out that 40% CO2, you're left with pretty much 100% methane. And that is molecularly equivalent when you process it to the conventional natural gas in our natural gas pipelines. At that point, it's totally interchangeable. It's just been renewably produced. It's a little bit more expensive to do that, but because our electricity prices are so low and there are some incentives in place to replace vehicle fuel, fossil fuel vehicle fuel with natural gas, and in our case, renewable natural gas, getting your biogas upgraded and into the pipeline so you can replace vehicle fuel and take advantage of those lucrative programs is becoming much, much more popular. And there's not a wastewater facility that is not looking at trying to inject their biogas into the pipeline right now. So that is the front wave. We actually had 2 wastewater facilities join just this week. Sioux City, Iowa was the one that joined last night because they are doing just that.
And are they piping a lot of it, dare I say, to California?
Everyone's trying to.
Okay.
Because there's a federal policy, there's a federal program, the Renewable Fuel Standard, and there is a low carbon fuel standard, which is mostly a California program, and you can stack the two together. And so and they're both vehicle related. So if you can sell to California, you get to take advantage of both programs, and that's where you make the big bucks.
I learned something.
This is the percentage of the operating wastewater facilities that have a biogas system, whether they're adding food waste or they're adding additional organics of some kind. And you can see there's a very minority of those facilities are adding in additional organics. The main reason for that is that it's just a little bit more complicated. You need a little bit more equipment. It's not that hard, but you can't just take an existing wastewater facility that's used to producing a very homogeneous sludge coming out of sewage and add things like food waste, which is a lot more variable, can have the risk for contamination. You generally don't have that many forks that you're screening out of our wastewater, although there's all kinds of interesting things that come through there, but you're going to have a much higher proportion of those kinds of things once you start dealing with food waste. All right, so now we get into the projects. So a couple of projects here to show you. This is Forest County Potawatomi. They are an American Indian nation in Wisconsin, and they have a casino. And they have put a digester system in the back of their parking lot, as you can tell there at the bottom. And we love that because they are taking the wastewater and the food waste from the casino, which there's plenty of, but they're processing it all right there on the property. And this is not a small biogas facility. We actually had, we've been doing some work with IndyCar this year, and we had 3 drivers go there and show up to the facility. And it's interesting because we talked a little bit about this earlier. The things that go into a biogas system can be very gross, right? So you can't have bad smells in the parking lot of the casino or the hotel where you have. And so it was interesting to see the IndyCar drivers kind of walk through and they're like, oh yeah, it's just some like tanks and some piping. And then they went into the facility where the material was, and it smells very different. And it just kind of shows you that you can, with some very simple engineering, you can handle really gross stuff right next to where people are, but you have to do it right. And being an American Indian culture, they are extremely proud of the fact that they are handling all of this material on site and even some imported material from around the area. And they are basically doing better they're treating our earth better than we would be otherwise. And that's really, that story is really, really important to them. They're making electricity and heat from their biogas, and they use the digestate, which is the digested material that goes through the biogas, to use it as a soil conditioner. All right, so here's another one. So Walt Disney World, if you go to those resorts, they produce a lot of wastewater, and they have a couple different wastewater plants that are down there. And one of them was taking their sludge that they pulled out of the wastewater and composting it, and it smelled awful, which was particularly a problem for the neighbors nearby, including some canine training folks and some people growing ornamental flowers. And so one of our members went down there and said, hey, why don't we take your composting facility and why don't we buy that land from you, and we'll take all your wastewater sludge and we're going to digest it instead in these airtight tanks that you see. But then we're also going to take in food waste from basically anyone that'll give it to us from all of the hotels and the resorts around the area, as much as we can get. And they built this, they call it the Harvest Energy Garden. They're also making electricity down there. They've got almost 3.5 megawatts and a bunch of heat that they're producing. And they have a really cool product that they make from their digestate. They dry it and they process it so it's really phosphorus rich, and then they sell it to the people that are growing the ornamental flowers down there for the resorts. All right, this is one of my favorites just because it's in our backyard. I'm from DC, so this is, we love this project. So it was built in 2015. For those of you who don't know, DC Water, right across the river, also known as Blue Plains, is the largest advanced wastewater treatment facility in the world. And by advanced, that means, so if you remember Danielle's charts where she was saying that there's like some screening that happens with wastewater, and then you basically let the solids settle out, and those go to the digester. And then she also talked about aeration happening. Aeration is another way to get other solids out of the wastewater, and then those solids go to the digester too. Well, DC Water has a third step. They have tertiary treatment, which basically means that the water coming out of their plant is like super, super clean. It's really cool. If you want to go on Google Earth and look at Blue Plains, look at the water in the Potomac River right next to the plant, and it is a beautiful blue next to the brown that surrounds everything out there. And if you go there, you'll often see fishermen there as well, because the fish love to congregate there just because of the water quality. So this plant's obviously been around forever. Before they put in this digester in place, they were taking 60 truck trips a day of solids out of the facility. 60 trucks every single day of our sewage, the solids that are coming out. The good news was that they were recycling in some local tree farms, a silviculture facility. But now they are digesting that material. And not only does the biogas system do really good things for taking in that organic material, they're producing a ton of energy from it. About 13 megawatts there, which is saving them over $10 million a year just in the electricity costs. And then it goes up to $15 million a year in other costs, because those 60 truck trips a day are now 30 truck trips a day. Because one of the things that happens with the biogas system is, as the material is broken down by the microbes and you're turning some of it into energy, as a mass balance, you're reducing the volume of solids that you end up with. It's about half. It depends on your system, but it's about half of the volume of the material. So now you just have less to deal with, but you also now have a much higher quality product in the end, a digestate product, which I'll tell you about in a second. So we've been backyard composting in DC. For any of you local folks, we've done vermicomposting. Both of those work pretty well. But to be honest, with our family with 2 little kids, we grind up our vegetables and put them down the garbage disposal, because I know those are going to get turned into biogas and renewable energy, and it's going to keep our water prices from going up any faster. Really important thing: do not put fats, oils, and greases down your drain ever whatsoever. But vegetables and other things.
Plug. Yes.
Oh, great. Did I
right.
do that okay?
You did perfect.
All right, good.
Fog.
Just Google fatbergs if you're wondering why.
Oh yeah, fatbergs. Ooh.
Terrible things. All right, so here's what DC Water is doing with their digestate. And there you can see my 6-year-old and decapitated 8-year-old shoveling some of it outside of the truck, because I'm friends with Chris, who runs the biogas facility, and we have a garden on Capitol Hill. And what's better than having free digestate and soil for your gardens and your lawn? No joke, I took before and after pictures. I should have put them in this slide. The our grass is so green after we just top dressed with this stuff last spring. So they're branding their product. I'm probably not going to be able to get it for free anymore because they're now selling it in bulk to a distributor that's selling it in Home Depot. So I challenge you to go around your garden center and see if you can find Bloom, which is the way that they're marketing their product. And it's basically like a mulch / soil conditioner. And the National Park Service is one of the biggest customers, so it's all around the mall as well.
Yeah, the big repairs on the mall the past few years. That's so you all contributed to it, right?
Yep, exactly. Good recycling right in our backyard. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I obviously have questions, but I'm going to let you guys start out, and then I'll kind of interject. So I have Amanda, William, and Richard. And who else is going to do the mics? Richard and Amanda? Oh, no, William. So just raise your hand and just say your name and your affiliation, just real quick, so they know where. Let me make sure I got it. Yeah, so they know where you're coming from. So start with quick questions, or I will start doing the Spanish Inquisition of my speakers.
I have a question too for our
Have a question? Yes. Why don't you start?
I was going to ask about, you talked about stormwater, like combined sewage overflow and combining stormwater. And so, stormwater, if you think about from an energy perspective for a biogas system, generally wastewater is about 4% solids. And we only care about the solids because that's where the energy is. That other 96% is just water. And we want it to be clean, but from an energy perspective, it doesn't do anything. So stormwater is even worse because it has like almost no solids in it. And DC's just been building these huge tunnels to help keep the stormwater from going into the river. So you had said something about maybe separating stormwater versus sewage, but then DC's combined them by making these huge tunnels that don't let it overflow. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you were thinking the best strategy is? And I'd also be interested, Scott, in what you guys are doing with that.
Sure. So as you mentioned, DC has a significant combined sewer problem. Essentially, any city that is not more or less brand new has a combined sewer problem because for a long time cities were designed this way. And because it is so expensive to more or less completely retrofit an entire sewer system, now we know that designing these municipal separated sewer systems, MS3s, are very, very the way to go. But because it is so hard to completely rip up under the streets of Washington, D.C., they only ripped up, I think, a couple neighborhoods, including my former Bloomingdale neighborhood, to put in these tunnels. And so that's also something we see New York doing. The idea is that if you hold the stormwater, you can prevent it from going into the system. So it's literally just a retaining facility or a tunnel that can allow that stormwater to go somewhere and essentially have it sit there until it's possible to treat it without overflowing or overwhelming those wastewater treatment plants. Because that's also an issue. If the combined sewers don't overflow themselves, we'll overload our wastewater treatment plants. And then there's also some interesting solutions that New York has been doing. They have actually a text program called Wait. You can sign up if you're a resident of New York City. You can sign up for text alerts, and the city will text you and tell you, like, hey, don't shower, don't do your laundry. Wait until the storm is over, so that they slow down that strain on the wastewater system. And so there's creative solutions that we know are happening like that. And then also urban greening is a huge help, because if we can create places for that water to go, the more concrete we have in a city, the more that water is not going to permeate, unless we've got permeable pavements, of course. But that concrete is essentially just causing the water to flow straight into sewers instead of allowing it to permeate into soil and gardens or things like that.
Well, in Beijing, about 8 years ago, about a dozen people drowned in downtown Beijing because of just a flood of water. I mean, in Chinese cities, you see these pictures of just, people driving their motorcycle through 2 feet of water. And so they have a big campaign, policy now called Sponge City. Have you heard of it? Mm-hmm. Sponge City. So the goal, it's basically green infrastructure. So like she mentioned, the sidewalks, but also more rooftop gardens. For the first few years, there was a lot of experimentation, because Sponge City, I mean, that's how they do it in China. They put out this we need to absorb more of our water, but it's it's been fairly successful in some of the cities. And and also just as China's grown richer, people want cities that are more livable. I mean, a lot of you go to China, right? And so some of the cities, I mean, it's just like Beijing in particular in the summer. It's just, I mean, there was now they're trying to green it more, but it's hot and it's just so much cement and there are floods. It's like out in Arizona, the flash floods that sweep cars away. But it reminds us too that Beijing is indeed a desert. So so the China's trying to move on that as well. But it's and they do have the newer cities because cities grow so quickly. But I don't, it's one of the questions I have is when I go back to China next is to find out where are they on their sewage system. Beijing, it's combined as well, right?
Yeah, Beijing has a combined sewer system. And then the last thing I'll say about this is another thing to think about when we consider stormwater is that not only does it not have good energy, as you mentioned, but oftentimes it has a lot of grit, which will wear down the wastewater treatment facility very quickly. If you think about like running gritty water through a system, you're essentially breaking down that the mechanical parts in the wastewater treatment plant.
What about California?
Well, stormwater, I mean, that's a huge issue in California, and I think now everyone has been really waking up to how we treat stormwater, how we look at it, how we sort of value it now. It used to be, yes, the systems were designed to get it off the street, get it into, your some sort of drainage system to just prevent flooding, to prevent that flash flooding. And for anybody at the coastal area, it's off the street and straight out into the ocean, which of course, unfortunately, especially when you haven't had rain for a long time, like we just, we had a long dry spell of 2 or 3 months with no real heavy storms. We call it the first flush. So when we get a big storm coming through and all kinds of stuff is coming from everywhere in the city of LA and their surrounding communities, and it's hitting those storm drains and it's just going right out into the ocean. And of course, unfortunately, usually what happens is they will close off beaches and swimming and surfing for sometimes up to a week. So even right now, after that storm that we just had, there's a lot of caution right there. But we are looking at how do you treat it differently, from our own perspective, and then what can you do with the water? And the question is if you do capture it, how can you get it into one of the treatment systems? And of course, how do you pay for that? But also on that, by the way, we're really working a lot on more decentralized storm capture systems. So a lot of times if it's in a local city, they might have an infiltration system that's under a park or some location or a green belt where at least you can do some treatment and it'll be used locally in that area, but it's also preventing a certain volume of water from hitting the storm drain, as well as being in compliance with different regulations. So there's just, to be honest with you, it's a very new movement. And
Santa Monica, I think when I was walking on Santa Monica, I think I saw some things like that. It was near the beach area where there were these big signs. I love it. It's so I'm nerdy. I'm like, oh my God, this is like an underground recycling of the. Exactly. But it was big.
Exactly.
All along Santa Monica beach area.
Yeah, and so it's happening. And then of course, what happens too is depending on the city, if it's the city of Santa Monica or it's the city of Los Angeles, it's the city of Hermosa Beach. Everyone's kind of doing their own thing. But we did just pass last year in November was a property tax assessment. We called it Measure W, which will provide up to about $300 million per year of funding through LA County that will be distributed to, we have 88 cities in our county. It'll be distributed in various ways to local projects. And so that was through our county and a board of supervisors, and the public did support it. It passed with over 2/3 support, which you had to have. And it did pass. We're very proud of the residents for that. And we're all actually trying to figure out now the bureaucracy of how we will get access to those funds. But again, it's a whole new territory. But the environmental community has been pushing that hard, as well as a lot of our residents.
Yeah, similar to, we're all talking about water today, but thinking about her example of Hurricane Sandy in terms of resilience. When I went to I've been to West Basin, and I also went to Hyperion.
I think you drank the water too.
I did drink the water, because I take a lot of times you think study tours, everyone wants to go to, where are you taking your study tour? I'm like, wastewater treatment plants, water recycling plants. But I even brought a group of Chinese green finance guys, a bank, because they were trying to get their brains around. I mean, this is not a sexy topic. We think it's sexy because we're weird, but these guys, these banker folks were thinking like, well, we got to figure stuff out. We got to figure out how are we going to finance. And so they came here to the States and I help them tour them around. But now about the resilience issue, like, I mean, you're right on the water.
Right.
I mean, what is California doing in terms of trying to not have a Hurricane Sandy situation that floods their wastewater treatment plants?
Well, like what Danielle said, I mean, our systems, and we have two of the largest west of the Mississippi, is the Hyperion Treatment Plant in the City of LA, and then the County of Los Angeles has one not too far from us in the City of Carson. But both of them are just not designed to take in the stormwater in addition to all the sewage water and wastewater that's already coming in. So it really is a matter of how can you retrofit at least to capture some of that and treat it, as well as some of the decentralized systems that we were talking about. But to be honest with you, this is the whole new quandary and challenge, and at the end of the day, too, who pays for it? And then you're gonna have this, the problem for us is obviously we'll have a long period of nothing, no water. That's why you see like the LA River, and it's just a little stream, and then all of a sudden there's a big storm, and then it's 10 feet, 20 feet of water, and yes, you see people being rescued, so one minute there's nothing, the next minute there's just too much water, and yes, we hear it all the time that everyone's criticizing, like, oh my gosh, why are you letting all that water go? But it's like, well, one, it wasn't designed for anything else, and it was actually designed now for flood protection. But separately, we are looking at things in a new way, and how can we potentially utilize that water or get it back into the groundwater in some way, shape, or form. So we're still trying to figure that out right now, especially at the coastal area.
Okay, let me open up for you guys out here. Have some questions? Tom? Yeah, he has to ask to say who you are, Tom.
Hi, Tom Frankowitz. It was EPA's Climate Change Division, and a lot of our work is focused on methane mitigation. So we work a lot with biogas, but it's kind of with the goal of reducing or capturing methane for energy use. And a lot of my work, our program's work is in China, and we work across the wastewater, or solid waste, wastewater, and agricultural waste sectors to encourage best practices, and a big part of that is biogas capture and utilization. Recently, we've been working on a best practices guide for waste and wastewater treatment in China. And about a month ago, we had a panel of experts review it at a waste conference. And it was surprising. On one hand, they were really excited about a lot of aspects, but, the thing we heard and got a lot of pushback on was, I think one of the rough quotes was, why are you coming and talking to us about nutrients and water recycling? We have a ton of sludge we need to get rid of. We just need to reduce the volume. And everybody keeps coming and talking to us about biogas and nutrients and all these other things. And Danielle, your presentation is pretty similar to what we do. We talk about all these great benefits. Like if you just do this, you could use all this energy, you could use the nutrients for all of these things. But especially municipal officials, one, they're on the hook for treating water and providing clean water. And two, now that, especially in China, they've built all this massive capacity for wastewater treatment, which is a good thing. Now they have
so
huge
much
mountains
sludge.
of sludge. So I guess my question is, how do you sell this? Because these are all the positive points I try to make, but the reality is municipal officials, and I think China's situation is maybe on the extreme, but it's certainly not unique. How do you deal with poor municipal officials that are just trying to get rid of sludge? And I think that could probably apply to anyone. I'd be curious.
Yeah, I think I might want Patrick to start, because I think the one angle that when we in some conversations we've had, they kind of get the climate angle, because all these same cities are under big pressure from Beijing to be low carbon, and I think is that
I would hope there'd be a carbon motivation, but I'm going to go dollars. Convince them that sludge is worth something. And after you convince the municipal folks that it's worth something, convince we need work on the stigma against biosolids, that material is worth something. Go to, look at Bloom. Start using that as a poster child. They're not the only ones doing something. There are a few other digestive products, but for a large wastewater plant that has a lot of material to deal with. And what happened was Chris Piatz, the guy who's the biogas project was basically his brainchild. I'm sure some of you know him. When they were building the huge tunnels that we were just talking about for combined sewage overflows, like a 400 huge dollar capital expenditures over many, many, many years. They were able to get the digesters in there because in the context of building tunnels and doing the rainwater and stormwater mitigation and lots of other upgrades, the digesters were, a small part of that, and they were able to get those capital costs included. So they built the digesters. But now they really want to do upgrades. They want to be able to take in food waste from the city and do other things. And the only way that Chris is able to get, and his team are able to get approval to do other things to their digester system is to convince the city, to convince DC Water, and they're kind of semi-public, private, right? To convince them that what I'm going to do is going to be cost neutral or provide revenue to the water agency. So they started selling renewable energy credits for the electricity, and they started selling Bloom. And so they are creating enough revenue from selling their sludge. And so it's a marketing challenge because I think for anyone who knows anything about sludge, if you can get it to Class A for Part 503, which is basically like the highest quality, it's where Class A is where you prove that your sludge has been processed enough that the pathogens, any concern for health issues are basically nil. And you do that by bringing the material up to a certain temperature for a certain number of days, usually. That's why that temperature part that I kind of got into there for a little bit is important. They happen to have a front-end pre-processing system that's basically like a pressure cooker for the sludge. So they ramp up the pressure, it kills the pathogens. Then they drop the pressure, and it breaks all the cell walls, and it makes their digestion work really well. That's kind of like the really advanced way of dealing with this. But the point is that they have a way to prove to everyone that the material is super, super safe. Now they can prove it with science, but there's still going to be an emotional reaction by a lot of people, and that's where the marketing comes in. Convince folks that sludge is worth something. That's going to be a marketing challenge with a little bit of science that already exists behind it to get people to believe you.
But so, I mean, I get the cost thing, but in terms of the emissions, I mean, right now in Madrid, the World Biogas Association is there, and they're pushing anaerobic digestion also as a climate solution, right?
Yeah. So, I think if you take the nice thing from a climate change perspective is, so we talked about reducing methane emissions. So you're generally assume that if you take this material that's going into the biogas system and you don't digest it, that it's going to produce methane emissions. And those methane emissions are really bad. So you want to stop the production of methane emissions from those feedstocks. Well, once you produce energy from the biogas system, you can also displace fossil fuels, usually, from electricity. So you get to double count in a very honest way, because you're reducing emissions from being released into the atmosphere, and you're reducing emissions over here, too, from using the energy. And once you do that, you can get, even from systems that aren't perfect, that might produce some carbon emissions. Like, for example, if you use renewable natural gas in a natural gas vehicle, there are going to be some emissions out of the tailpipe. But overall, those emissions are probably zero or negative because you've reduced them in so many other places. And so I think the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard and the California Air Resources Board does a really good job of looking life cycle, how many carbon emissions come out of projects. And so if you take a wastewater plant that's taking sludge or taking sewage into it, and then you're using that biogas for transportation fuel, it's generally about a 90% emission reduction from having not doing that. So you're like almost zero just from a wastewater plant. You can get carbon negative. There are ways to be even better than that, but that's just kind of a really rough rule of thumb to use as well. 90% reduction.
So some other questions out here? Okay, back in the corner.
Hi, I'm Tess Erickson from the water team at the State Department. I guess this sort of is a good follow-up to the point on getting carbon neutral or losing out on emitting carbon, but a sort of flag went up in my head when you said that there was CO2 that had to be diverted off from the methane before you could inject it back into the fuel lines. And I'm just wondering, is there anything that's done with that? Because it's not flammable at normal atmospheric conditions, so you can't just burn it off. Is anything done with that, or is that just caught up in the whole, like, it's a net loss thing?
So you're talking about the CO2 that you pull
Yeah.
out of the biogas to make like renewable natural gas to make.
Yeah, because that's like
So
single
most of the
biggest
times that's just emitted into the atmosphere,
Okay.
and the logic is that you're reducing methanes, which is 20 to 100 times worse than CO2, and releasing a little bit of CO2 in the context of the whole project is allowable given the massive other benefits you're making. To give you some numbers on how really allowable you can justify that being with real science from government agencies like the California Air Resources Board. If you take a dairy and you digest the manure and you use that biogas for transportation fuel, you are like at a negative 200 to 300 in your carbon intensity. And to give you some context for that, I already told you like 10 to 15 is the score for like a wastewater plant. Using processing gasoline, using in gasoline vehicles or diesel and diesel buses and trucks, that's like a positive 100 in terms of the carbon emissions that are put out. So you want to get down to zero or negative. These dairy systems, which are emitting CO2 from processing the biogas, can be a negative 200 to 300 on this. So you can be massively carbon negative. It's hard economically. Sometimes you can use the CO2. The problem is the CO2 isn't as pure as you need it to be for like beverages or like an industrial gas. You can use it for greenhouses, but then you got to have a greenhouse nearby to do that. There are a couple projects that are doing that. That's the coolest story, to reuse that CO2.
Cool. Thank you.
And you mentioned about California Resources Board, but are there ways that that you said there are calculations out there or tools that people can measure? Because I think that's the big challenge in Chinese cities, that it will help if they can make the sale not only by saving money, but it's also just that it lowers their CO2, that they're low
So the
carbon.
California Air Resources Board, CARB, does a life cycle analysis of projects that participate in their low carbon fuel standard, the LCFS. And CARB, the government agency for air, as you would guess, uses a model called the GREET model, GREET, and that's developed by Argonne National Lab.
Okay.
So lots of really good science that's very defendable.
So I can
behind all
take my study to somewhere else besides the sludge treatment plants. Okay, this is good to know. Some other questions out here? It's over here.
Hi, my name is Eileen, and I just moved to the U.S. I used to work in Shanghai and Chengdu to do the. I am a process designer for the water treatment and wastewater treatment plant. So I'm glad that Jennifer invited me today to this event, and I have a question for Daniel. I'm really interested in your speech. I think today. Nobody mentioned too much about the stormwater management, this part. Because based on my experience, I know nowadays China, some of design institute, they have already started to do some stormwater management, even though it's hard because, the wastewater treatment system has already been built for a long time. So if you want to design the rainwater pipeline based on this systems is kind of hard and have some challenges here. I want to know, because I just moved to the US, maybe I do not have more knowledge about this part, but I want to know in like those mega cities like LA or DC or New York City, is there any like organizations or programs about like stormwater management? I'm curious about this part. I think you might have answers for my question. Thank you.
We could definitely hook her up to the people in New York and Blue
Yeah.
Plains.
Yeah. Like you said, it's a genuinely very difficult problem, and I think at risk of preaching to the choir, I think stormwater is one of the largest enemies of the types of systems that we've all been promoting today, because the worst thing for anaerobic digestion is watered down wastewater. And so I think that, like you said, it's a really difficult problem because, as we've mentioned, retrofitting these systems is very difficult. And so the most successful solutions I've seen occur on a hyper-local level, which I don't remember who said that, but a lot of, Patrick was talking about how you really can't have these cookie-cutter solutions. But for example, there's a great neighborhood program in Queens where they have locals who are able to develop these urban green spaces. And so you get, like we've mentioned, like this double win where you're able to green cities that desperately need greening just for like recreation and quality of life for its citizens, but then you're also able to replace that concrete and offer different places for water to go when it's raining. I think outside of the US, I think Singapore is a great example of really good ways of harvesting rainwater. And so the ultimate win is not only are you keeping that water off of the concrete, but if you're able to harvest it, then you can use it as drinking water. And so it's not a complete loss. And instead of overflowing your wastewater system, you're able to actually develop more drinking water.
Yeah, and we can introduce you to the DC. One thing, all of you, I'm serious. If you're local in DC, you've got to do the tour of DC Plains. Happens almost every Thursday. You may have to wait a few weeks, but I mean, because I'm sure my current interns are so sad. I didn't take you guys to the wastewater treatment plant. The spring interns, William, you're one of my new guys. We're going there, man. There happens to be one of their engineers is a Chinese gentleman. I tried to get him to come today, but he was gallivanting about, I think, in China, because they've been, because Hyperion, the one that we have here, it's not as big as the one in California. Ugh. But in some way, well, no, wait, you said this one here is the biggest? But in California, Hyperion said they were bigger, and so I don't know.
It's the biggest advanced. It's the biggest one that has
Advanced.
tertiary treatment.
There's kind of like, this kind of like, showing off on the
Exactly.
different
Chicago
coasts.
have the
Yeah.
largest ones that have secondary treatment.
I think DC Water's claim to fame is that Animox treatment process.
It
Can be.
Okay, so there's a lot of nerdy competition between wastewater sludge treatment plants, but anyway, that the engineer, I think it's Dr. Chen is his name, that he goes to Beijing and he's working with the Hyperion plant you were talking about,
Which also uses Canby.
which
They
uses
use it
Canby,
in
yeah, and
Beijing,
so
yeah.
That's the pressure cooker. That's one of the pressure cooker technologies.
you guys need to go because again, this is part of the joke that yes, you are contributing to it, but it's also if you're in Montgomery County, Prince George's, or DC, it's lowering how much you pay for water. In my heart, I feel like we should pay more
At
for
least
water
slowing the
anyway.
increases.
Yeah, it's slowing. Okay, that you're very diplomatic. It's slowing the increases. I probably have time for like one more question. Well, if they're quick, so a quick one. You need the microphone though, please. William, can you come on over here? No, he'll come to you.
Hi, yeah. I have a question for
Oh,
Scott.
and who are you?
My
Sorry.
name is Fernando Batista, and I'm with Vivid Water Technologies.
Okay.
I'm a director there. Scott, I just have a question about how you separate the different waters in your area, because like in Torrance, you have a lot of car companies, chemical companies, you have all this stuff. How does that all work over there?
What do you mean by separating at the?
Well, those are industrial waters, so the waste is different, right?
Like the different markets that your boutique, your
Okay.
designer water.
I guess if you're referring to our recycled water program and how it's going out to different users, is that what you mean?
Well, I mean, it seems like municipal water is very different, right? You're dealing with water from.
Well, okay. Well, there'd be two pieces, I guess. So on the one hand, if you're looking at just all the wastewater, as far as wastewater goes, that any of the organizations or whether it's residential, commercial, et cetera, that they're producing, obviously that's going to a treatment plant. As far as the waste, if that's what you're talking about, and then of course you do have certain industries like a refinery. A lot of things are on site, and they're recycling the water on site once it's already in their facility. So they may or not have certain waste that's going to go to a treatment plant, although there's always certain constituents that have to go to a wastewater treatment plant that'll be discharged with other items. But as far as then our system, as far as the way it's designed, it's mostly produced in the one location at our plant. However, some of the water that goes for specific needs, we have satellite facilities. So if it'll get pumped over to one of the refineries, for example, then there's further treatment, if it's nitrification or denitrified or whatever they need specifically. There's certain things, because also the distance, so it's like if we're producing it here and then we pump it maybe 20 miles away, and then they're doing some on-site further treatment right there at the the new source, if you will, before it goes into production.
And Scott, are other cities following the West Basin model? Because I think You guys strike me as
No, well, we really were, and this is not, I wasn't there yet, but we were ahead of the game when it comes to recycled water and just having such a diverse portfolio. And we happen to have some really unique industries in our service area, which did entail 3 refineries. And of course, so those are nice big customers, big users. And when you can put them on recycled water rather than the potable water we're bringing in from faraway places, that's just tremendous. And one of the things that actually did was when we had our historic drought and we had those mandates that Governor Jerry Brown enforced across our whole state on potable water, well, that affected everybody who was using potable water, including industries. So if you're doing manufacturing or if you're in oil production or what have you, and you had recycled water that you could use, well, guess what? You could continue running your operation as normal. So it actually protected a number of our industry partners for us to have recycled water for them to use. And
another climate resilience.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And again, that's water it's not being imported and used for those types of purposes, as well as it's not water that would have been treated and discharged out to the ocean. You're reusing it another time. And then, but to your point, West Basin really has been a model for a long time of a local municipality doing very progressive work, if you will. And a lot of other water districts, of course, have seen that and come and toured, and we help them as they're looking at their opportunities in their own service areas. And this is not just in California, but across the United States and around the world, because we do get a lot of folks who come from different places. And I would say last thing is, again, the drought, about 3-4 years ago, that just opened up a whole new window of opportunity in the sense that the public really understood it, and other water districts, really had that support from the residents and ratepayers that you guys need to do new things and different things. And so that's why you need to do more recycled water, whether it's for one purpose or 2 or 3 purposes. You've got to do more on-site, capture, reuse, and then it insulates you from the ups and downs of climate change and the water sources you may have access to, whether it's groundwater or it's surface water coming into your area.
Okay, well, this is good. Well, again, I prove that I have the best job in Washington, D.C., because I get to have smart people talk about things that are a bit off the beaten path, but I think it's vitally important, this whole water closing the loop business.
Putting them on the beaten path.
Yeah.
Yes, that's it. Oh, I like that better. We're going to put it on the beaten path. I want to thank all of you for coming. If you're new to the China Environment Forum, you should join our mailing list. Besides, we're going to continue working with EPA on methane capture, probably having some meetings in the spring looking, because this is a renewable energy. So we're going to, again, putting it on the beaten path. We're going to have people talking about, wind, solar, waste methane. I've had similar meetings in the past, but the story is always changing. Also, in case you didn't know, we've gotten some support from National Geographic. We're starting to create an educational video game on plastic waste. So keep an eye open. We're, this whole waste theme, I'm kind of liking it. So 2020 for me is going to be not wasted. All right, thank you very much. And join our mailing list. Thanks again. Let's applaud our speakers.